I'd like to begin today with a simple story from a parish I know well. It is a small parish in the Diocese of Virginia. And when I was rector of that parish, I was once asked about some documents that were in the basement of the rectory and had been ignored for some time. And I took some interest in reading them. They were the minutes of the women of the church in the parish. And I heard about a meeting which took place in November of 1913. It was a point in which the vestry was having financial problems. As I looked at the vestry minutes, I saw that the vestry, which at that point was composed of a continuous body, there were no term limits. And so people served, as they did often in parishes, 30, 40, 50 years on the vestry. You sometimes will see plaques in the church on the wall. Howard Jones, who served the vestry of this parish for 40 years. And it was all male, and the vestry members were having trouble meeting a budget. And their problem was in part structural. In the 19th century, Episcopal churches had been funded with a dual system. Most of the expenses of the parish and the salary of the clergyman and the coal, if the parish had a furnace, was paid for by renting pews, much in the way that people today rent seats in a stadium for a sports team or rent season tickets for the opera or for going to see a play. People rented the pews in which they sat in many American denominations in the 19th century. And then when it came to mission was funded, and that was used broadly, by special offerings. And so in the course of a number of Sundays, you would have a special offering for the Sunday school, a special offering for Chinese missions, a special offering to support the diocese, a special offering to support some local cause. By the end of the 19th century, most people realized that it was a little bit offsetting for strangers and newcomers to come into a church and be told they could not sit where they desired to sit in the church. And so people gradually abandoned requiring the rental of pews for people to sit in the church. In this particular parish, this is Grace Church in Berryville, in the 1880s, they announced that thereafter they would rent no pews, but they fudged just a little bit. If you were a regular giver, you could ask the treasurer of the parish to assign you a place to sit, but you didn't own it. It wasn't rented to you. And anyone who was visiting the church as a stranger or newcomer could sit in any vacant spot in the church. The problem was that when they eliminated the pew rent, most of the parishes in this country couldn't figure out what they needed to use to replace it. And so those who gave regularly the amount they used to give for pews when pews were rented became fewer and fewer in number. Now they had a certain advantage. They were the only people who could serve on the vestry. If they were males, you had to be known to the treasurer. And so they were known by asking the treasurer to appoint them a seat. Nobody else could, but most people, newcomers, tended to just give to mission projects. And so every year it was harder and harder to meet the budget. Well, in November of 1913, as the men in the, and I didn't mean problems, but problems, men facing financial problems accepted an invitation of the Ladies Parish Aid Society to come to the vestry meeting. And they said, you need to straighten things out. You need to adopt business-like methods. And if you want to know how to do that, we'll tell you what to do. And so they grumbled a little bit, I guess, but finally they listened to the ladies of the parish and they said, here's what it means today to have business-like methods. There's a little company in Richmond, Virginia called the Duplex Envelope Company. And they will be able to provide us with envelopes that have two sides to each envelope, one side to support the parish and one side to support the mission. And if we adopt this system, everybody will be asked to contribute to both things we need to support, the mission outside and in the community, and actually supporting the church. And the men of the vestry listened. And quite interestingly, the budget of the parish immediately went up. Now, at the same time, the parish nearby had somebody who was a general convention deputy, and he was bringing back news that the same discussion was taking place about the way in which we might be able to support a national budget. And so if you look at the minutes of general convention, people were standing up and saying, you know, we don't have any idea within millions of dollars how much money actually is collected in the Episcopal Church, because every parish and every diocese has a different form of accounting. We need standard methods, and we need some standard way to raise funds and have endowments. We need to organize. And what was going on was people were looking over their shoulders first at big businesses and the idea of interchangeable parts, large companies in America, the way they were operating. And then as the second decade of the 20th century went on, they also began to look at the way the US organized to enter World War I and the way the US tried to organize to fight the Spanish flu and the great pandemic that had begun by 1919. And so they looked at the way people did things, both the women in the parish and the men, at that point, only men at General Convention. We need to learn something from people who want to run big organizations, because we're not doing a very good job. And so among the things they did was a pair of things that seemed to go hand in hand. They adopted a system requiring mandatory retirement for clergy at a certain age. And then they copied Inland Steel, the great steel company in Chicago, which was one of the first large industries to have a pension. And they created the church pension fund. This gentleman with the jaunty top hat in my slide is Bishop Lawrence of Massachusetts, who happened to know a number of leaders of industry and finance in America, and he almost single-handedly raised the money to create the church pension fund. So we will have set terms. People will retire, and then we can bring younger people on board, but we won't throw people out without anything. We'll have a pension fund. The church decided, General Convention decided, to have a nationwide financial campaign to raise money for endowments for projects in the church, and they allowed each diocese to use some for local things and some went to the national church. In the case of the Diocese of Virginia, the funds went either for purchasing what is today the church schools in the Diocese of Virginia. So Christ Church School was made possible by the nationwide campaign. The diocese purchased a couple schools already in existence and then founded new ones. They also decided that they needed a new church in Charlottesville to minister to students at the University of Virginia. And so the new building was built for St. Paul's, which is across from the University of Virginia, so that they would have a parish, a fitting building to attract students. The decision was made to, on a parish level, by many parishes and dioceses, to make the service on the vestry rotating, so that at the end of a 3-year term, you could not be elected until you stepped off the vestry for a period of time, often 1 year. And the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church was made an elective position, so that instead of simply having the person who had been bishop longest be presiding bishop, after 1919, that was made an elective position. When the then presiding bishop retired, they elected a new presiding bishop. And finally, there was, for the first time, the creation of a national executive committee for the whole church. There had been a board of missions, an auxiliary to the board of missions. There had been another body for the Sunday School Society. There had been a society for the Tract Society, but there was no central organizing principle. And so the National Council, later renamed the Executive Council, was created for the Episcopal Church. We began to look a little bit like a business that was run on a national basis. Now, this jaunty gentleman on the left is Arthur Sheldon Lloyd. He was a bishop in Virginia. And after only serving in Virginia for about 2 years, he accepted a position to become the chairman of the Board of Mission, the director of the Board of Mission. Interesting thing, you notice that his clerical collar opens in the front until the back, and rather than the back. Clergy in Episcopal Church now wear collars open in the back. That was not entirely clear until the end of the 1930s, that you didn't open your collar in the front. So here he is, a Virginian, keeping the old way of having his collar in the front rather than the back. But in any case, when he retired at the end of his almost 20 years as head of the Board of Mission, he gave a valedictory address, a salutatory address, a goodbye address in December of 1919. And he said, "It is a day of rejoicing for the Board of Mission, because we suddenly have the funds we always wanted. Much of the money that went to the national church in the nationwide financial campaign was given to endowments to support mission projects." And he said when he had taken over about 1900, he had a budget of about $600,000. When he retired, that had now reached $3.25 million as a budget. And I frankly don't know whether that's the budget for 3 years or the budget for 1 year, but in any case, you can see that there is a substantial, more than 5-fold increase in the funds that are available. And he liked the idea of the National Council. He said, "The church has found that a headless body cannot have intelligence." And so he disliked the idea of there being no body, no structure that headed all of the church between general conventions. And he was excited about that. One of the things that the larger budget allowed and the new central body allowed was he had been able to convince and cajole all of those independent missionary societies to join the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, and indeed to convince the independent church in Haiti to be received, and several overseas churches. There was an independent Church of Jesus in Mexico, founded in the probably 1880s by disillusioned Roman Catholic clergy who dreamed of a different kind of church. A similar body in Puerto Rico. Those groups became overseas missions of the Episcopal Church and received funds and support. Of course, one of the great sources of financial support in addition to this budget was the money that was raised by the women of the church through the United Thank Offering. And they had, they were smart, a group of women who were the Emery sisters, were the pilots of the Women's Auxiliary to the Board of Mission. They raised their own funds and they gave them where they wanted, which meant that almost all their gifts went, the majority of their gifts went for women missionaries to make sure that they had the supplies they needed, and or to missionary couples. They were careful about how the funds were used. And so those funds, the funds from an increased national budget, the support from this National Council, all began to put a kind of structure to the overseas mission of the Episcopal Church. And there was one other interesting source of funds, and that was the mite box. In 1878, the Episcopal Church started buying mite boxes from the story of the widow's mite from Baptist and Methodist, and then sending them to Episcopal Sunday schools so they could use those to raise fund during Lent. And then the funds were presented at Easter time, and that offering was raised. You can see here, this is a little chart that was used in a copy of the Spirit of Missions, which was the name of the Episcopal Church magazine. When they started in 1878, they raised $7,000. By 1905, they got to $121,000, but by 1919, they were over $200,000. And so those mite boxes were collected. And I think the reason for the chart is quite often the mite boxes had figures and pictures on them of the recipients. We're raising funds this year for China, or we're working particularly on missions to Native Americans. We are working on ministry to young people. So there is there's a kind of growth in funding during this period of time. So suddenly the Episcopal Church got organized, looking at and paying attention to what was going on in business, what other people who understood organization were working on. So I want to pause here to ask a question and to receive any kind of comments. This reorganization took place in a time where Episcopalians had to think of a lot of new things, how to come up with chaplains to serve with the military overseas, how to train chaplains, how to deal with ministry in a time of the Spanish flu. And they came up with different budget methods. They came up with a new financial campaign. They came up with a new structure. And I guess my question is, have you noticed, are you noticing ways in which our life and structure is being changed by the pandemic that we've been wrestling with for the last year?
My suggestion is that we allow ourselves to unmute. I'm sure everybody has an answer to that one. Is that okay with you, Bob?
That's fine with me.
I think the video streaming of the services is going a long way towards, and we're reaching out beyond just the people in our own church. We're reaching out to others. And I think probably Father Stuart could tell you more, since he's been fully involved with the vestry, voted to fund the live streaming with a considerable amount of money. I might add. Stuart, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, really. I mean, other than the fact that, you know, we are reaching people that aren't part of the congregation now. We're reaching people far across the country, and we're even reaching and beyond this country to Nigel in England, who watches the services occasionally. So, you know, it really is touching people's lives in a very different way.
I've often thought about the way in which the experience of putting an envelope in the offering plate is disappearing. That was a key ingredient of adopting the duplex envelope system in 1919. You wanted not just to have some group of people who gave the treasurer a check once a year. You wanted to have people who made the act. And I think Episcopalians around this time started raising up the offering plate and sometimes playing even the Star Spangled Banners and making a great glorious moment of the presentation of the offering. It was a way in which to say to people, when you put that money in the offering, that's a significant thing. And now increasingly, I mean, it was happening before the pandemic, but more and more people are sending a check, having withdrawals from their electronic bank accounts, doing other. Stuart, do you miss raising up the offering plate at the?
Very much so. But
It's
it-
definitely a part of the church service that I miss.
um,
And I've been going to other churches as a result of not being able to go to this one.
mhm.
And as a result, I've been making donations in those churches
So,
during the pandemic
mhm,
that I might otherwise have been making to ours.
Mm.
It does expose me to some of the differences
mhm,
between our way of doing things and some of the other denominations.
mhm.
And that's been an interesting experience for me to some extent, that I wasn't familiar with some of what I have encountered.
Mhm.
In a nutshell, one of my observations would be that the Episcopal Church is more tolerant and love-based in its outlook on religion,
Mm.
and the Anglicans are more judgmentally oriented. Just for example,
Mhm.
and I've been to a Baptist church too, which of course is where the Montague family all went after the Revolution, when the
Mhm.
Episcopal Church of England fell into such disfavor. And I don't know whether you're aware, Bob, two of our Montague collaterally related ancestors were rectors of Glebe Landing Baptist Church up the road here.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
About that.
That's on my.
This didn't have anything to do with COVID, but the tax laws and things have changed to the point that when people are at a certain age, they can make their contributions directly from their retirement accounts. And so therefore, I'm seeing more and more people make their annual payment of their pledge to the church in one lump sum. And again, that's not coming through the plate. It's coming through an electronic transfer through a brokerage firm to one big check into the church account. And which is great for the church's budget. But, like you said, that symbolism of putting your offerings in the plate and presenting them to God, lifting them up in the plate at the offertory is not as prevalent.
This is Marilyn, real quick, and I think these live streamings are wonderful. And I hope all these sessions go on our website too, because I think people at different times are busy doing things or whatever, but still want to hear the messages. And they are very important. And Bob, your one slide or frame that was titled "The Spirit of Missions, Sunday School Offerings,"
Yes.
with that 28-year time period, that would be so neat in the newsletter. For the fact that when it started, how it grew, and it continuing to grow. And I hear the part very much so about offering literally on Sundays, because we don't do that. We do the one check. And there is a lot to be said for sitting in the pew and shaking your head no when the usher comes by to put something in the offering plate. And it is symbolic. And I'm just sitting here thinking to myself, do Dave and I want to handle that a tad bit different? And I think as you see people physically participate, there's a message there. It might be subtle, but it's a message.
That's Stuart, were you pounded when you went to Rocky Bar?
Was I what?
Were you pounded?
No, I know what you're saying, but no, I was not. They had kind of stopped that kind of
Okay.
practice.
But
At
when
that
I
point.
went to Berryville, I was told I was going to be pounded. And I didn't know initially what that was. This was 1980. But parishioners came in and brought a pound of flour, a pound of sugar, and I think it was a leftover from before the duplex envelope system. in the 19th century, when churches were closer to a barter system, they often remunerated the clergy person by just bringing some food. So, you know, here, we'll share our chicken with you or something. And so we got, when we moved into the rectory, we were pounded. I don't think they did that to my successor, but I'm not sure.
I don't know if it would take me forever to find them. My house is so disorganized, but I actually have some of those duplex envelopes from back in the early 1900s. And I also have, I think, 2 mite boxes from the early 1900s that were, I mean, there were a number of them during a renovation at Grace Memorial in Port Republic when they pulled down the walls to do some renovations. How they got in the walls, I don't know, but there were some mite boxes and duplex envelopes. And so some were left with the parish, and then I brought some with me. So if I find them, I'll bring them down and we can put them on display at some point.
It was interesting. The Episcopalians got tired of paying Baptists for their mite boxes. So the head of the education department invented first a pyramid-shaped mite box, and then what he called the keystone design, and he got the patents on those. So Episcopalians could print their own mite boxes without having to turn to other denominations to do that. Well, thank you for reflections, and we could go on for the rest of the evening, because I do think we're in an interesting time where things are changing, as the church does. About 1992 was the first time that there were church websites in the Episcopal Church. And now that seems like such a common thing that people can't quite remember when that didn't happen. Well, I want to jump forward a little bit and talk about the period after World War II, the trajectory that was started by 1920, the idea of a centralized church structure that supported mission, the idea that giving would be so structured that everybody would contribute to the mission of the church and to the support of the parish. That was successful in changing the life of the church. And it was particularly important, I think, to those who had seen other parts of the world during World War II. And many of those after 1945 who were entering seminaries had experiences, GIs, during World War II, and they came back. As far as I can tell, the story of the Virginia Seminary, Theological Seminary class of 1950 is unequaled in the history of the church. 1 out of every 4 people in the graduating class in 1950 served outside of the 48 states at that point. And some of them spent their whole lives in missions. Others spent shorter periods of time, 6 or 8 years, but it colored their perspective. And one of the early missions that was supported in Virginia, that of the mission in Brazil, originally by the Fairfax Mission Society and then by the National Church, reached by 1949 an important milestone for an Anglican church, and that is to say, it got to the point that it was big enough to divide in 3 dioceses. In an Anglican church in the world, in the Anglican communion, a church that has 3 dioceses is big enough to be its own province. And so of former Episcopal missions, Brazil would be the first one, which would become independent of the United States and become an independent province in the Anglican communion. This is the picture that they use at the seminary in Porto Alegre in their calendar for one of their saints of the church. And it's a kind of interesting, this was the presiding bishop of the church in Brazil in the 1960s, in that period after they moved to independence in the United States. And his name was Sumio Takatsu. And it's kind of interesting. The early missionaries who went to Brazil had friends who went to Japan and China. And because of that, they were aware of missionary efforts in Japan when in the early 20th century, a large number of Japanese emigrated to Brazil to work in plantations. The Episcopal Church was the first church to respond to them. And so there are some parts of Brazil where apparently people refer to the Episcopal Church as the Church of the Japanese. So they, one of the first priests to be active among the Brazilians of any denomination was an Episcopal missionary who had learned of the effort in Brazil from Episcopal missionaries in Japan. And so this was one of the success stories of the 1950s. In 1957, the Episcopal Church created a missionary diocese of Central America, which in 1964 would become Province 9, but it was a step toward expanding the mission of the Episcopal Church in Central America. One of the jokes that people tell in Latin America is a sort of question, which is, who are the two people most responsible for the expansion of the Anglican Church in Central America? And the answer is Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro, because Mao Zedong threw out all the foreign missionaries after the Chinese Revolution. And so you had groups of missionaries who were trying to, and let's see, they were groups of missionaries who were trying to find some new place to work. And then Fidel Castro threw out missionaries from Cuba, and Cuban Episcopalians led the way toward Spanish language congregations in the United States. And Greg, I have a question. My screen just went blank. Have I got to do something fancy?
No, I have a feeling your computer went to sleep. Was that possible?
It could be. Though I don't know exactly how I can get it to get.
Start with just hitting escape,
Okay.
and then
Will we come back?
yeah, because we've lost your screen. We have your cursor, but we don't have your screen. You are right.
Oh, so that's interesting. I didn't know you could. Okay, I'll come back here again and see.
There
Okay,
you
I
go.
saw it and I'm trying to revive it. There it goes. Okay, or there it went.
We're still seeing a blank screen though, or a black screen, I should say. There it goes. Well,
There it went.
it was there for a moment. There you are.
Well,
It
I
won't
don't know
go into
if I sit here
presentation
and-
mode. You may have to close PowerPoint and reopen it.
Okay, I'll close that one and then see if I can go back to screen sharing stopped. Okay, I have to start.
Well,
again.
yeah, because you shared the application, not the screen itself. Well, yeah, we were looking at your screen though. I'm not sure. It's okay. We're a patient group.
Oh, no, I can even make a new one. Okay.
Just go up. You can do a file open. Oh, there it comes.
Yes, okay. So this was a moment in which things were going well. I've got to move my. You know, in no, I don't want my Zoom to go away.
You can just minimize it up in the upper corner, upper And then try going into presentation mode from down at the bottom.
Hang on just for a second. I think if I go slideshow from the beginning. We're back.
Yeah, it looks like we are.
Okay.
There you go.
In 1958, the Church of England said, you know, we're not such a big empire anymore, and we don't have the funds. We would like the Episcopal Church to take responsibility for Central America, which previously had been largely the work of the Church of England. And I will say the one way to describe what was going on in the Episcopal Church was in the 1950s, we had a mission-driven budget. If you looked at the annual budget of the Episcopal Church, it was mission overseas, mission in education, mission to domestic peoples, mission, virtually everything was identified as mission. It was the byword of the church. And quite often parishes did what we did, and that is they once or twice a year had an adult education event that focused on mission and often on one particular area. We'll talk about mission to Native Americans this year. And that was a moving experience in the part of in the ministry of the Episcopal Church. One of the stories was that people love to tell was of William Gordon, who was a Virginia seminary student, and he was he was elected Bishop of Alaska, which then was not yet a state, back in 1948, before he was old enough to be consecrated a bishop. The canons say you have to be 30. And so he got a job at the bookstore at Virginia Seminary and sort of hung around until he got old enough to be consecrated a bishop. And then he went to Alaska. And one of the first things he did was that he said to the women in the church, I can't get around if I don't have an airplane. Everybody in Alaska flies. I'm going to take flying lessons. The women of the church devoted a United Thank Offering gift to him to buy. Now, this is the original plane, but originally it was blue. It's been painted since. They called it the Blue Box. And he would visit remote Arctic Circle congregations, flying in his plane, the Blue Box. And I think there even was one year the Mite Box had a picture of the Blue Box. And if you go to Virginia Seminary, you'll see we have a window which has a picture of the Blue Box in the background to show Gordon and his work in Alaska. He excited people, and lots of people from Virginia went and served in Alaska. Al Reiners, who came from St. George's in Arlington, and whose daughter, Sarah Bartenstein, was the editor of the Virginia Churchman for a long time. He went to Alaska and founded a congregation which he called St. George's in the Arctic, and served there early on in his ministry, and then came back to Virginia. And Gordon was a smart man. Working with others, he began to notice all sorts of things about mission. One was, he said, you know, it doesn't work to take someone from a small Athabascan Indian community in the Arctic Circle and send them away to go to college for 4 years, and then to seminary for 3 years, and then bring them back to Alaska, because when they come back, they won't want to go back. They will have been so estranged from the culture of which they were a part that they won't be able to serve. And he got together with some other people, was impressed by some of the books that he read about mission, particularly by a man named Rowan Allen. He convinced the General Convention with others in 1969 to create a new category of local clergy, in which a local headman, a local person, could be identified and could become a priest of the church without going to college and without ever leaving their town. We call those for a long period of time Canon 9 clergy, though in fact they were originally Canon 8, and then they went on to be Canon 11 because we kept adding canons before them. And that system remained in effect from 1969 until 2003, when canons were revised again. And Walter Hannum, who was a member, who was involved in one of the congregations, was an archdeacon, I think, working with Native American people. He said, people have some trouble sometimes with some of the language of the Book of Common Prayer is wonderful. But if we want to deal with people for whom English is a second language, we might want to have a simpler language. And so our first published, or one of our first published revisions of the Book of Common Prayer was a short common prayer in common English, which was produced for use in the mission field, so that people could have the same service, same structure, but they would not have the same, they wouldn't have the same Elizabethan language, or not as much. So 1950s, 1960s, really a high point of mission, central headquarters, a central office, a common plan, and a program that touched the hearts of people in the Episcopal Church. It was, I think, over our whole history, the point where we had the most concerted plan for assisting in foreign mission. But as people pointed out at that time, not everything was perfect about the system. And people began to think over, if you will, of some ways in which this might be a better plan. Roland Allen had written a book back in 1913, a sort of odd English person who was a missionary for about 4 years in India, came back, married a rich woman, and then never really had to earn an income again, but he spent a lot of time thinking about his experience in India. He wrote a book called Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours. And he noted how in the Bible, Paul seems to hand off leadership rather quickly to local people. He supports them from a distance, but he does not simply, he doesn't continue to select their own leaders. He doesn't continue to tell them everything they must do, though he did have a lot to say. Rowan Allen wrote this, and it became very important for people as they look at missions in the church. At the same time, of course, the former British colonies beginning in Asia gained their independence. And suddenly you had countries where the Anglican Church was very much a part of the local culture, and what had been missions of the Church of England became the Anglican Church in the province of Kenya, or the Anglican Church in Nigeria, and other churches began to take their place as independent provinces. This is a picture of a very important meeting that took place in 1963. It was called the Anglican Congress. This is only the second or third time it gathered, but it was a sort of, if you will, a family reunion for people from the Anglican communion the world over. They met in Toronto at the same time that there also was a meeting of a committee to talk about missions for the Anglican communion. And they ended up adopting a statement unofficially, which was called the MRI statement, Mutual Respect and Interdependence in the Body of Christ. It was a critique of the way mission was being done and a vision forward to what might be done. And what they said basically was, the best evangelists are the people within culture. It is not economically very sensible to bring somebody from overseas and then support them for the 4 or 5 years it takes for them to become really fluent in the local language. What we could use are teachers, farmers, doctors, people who understand accounting. We need people who can support the mission, but they should come on invitation of the local bishop. You shouldn't have somebody who is sitting in New York or London or Toronto, who simply decides where you ought to go. My college chaplain was a man named John Snow, who had been in charge of the Board of Mission of the Episcopal Church at one point. And he said, you know, I got tired of people coming to my office in February saying that God had called them to go to Polynesia or Hawaii. Maybe it made some sense that we ought to listen to the voice of God in the people in the receiving culture. And so it did start a new way of looking at mission, not quite as centralized as this great period beginning in the 1920s, but with much more cooperation of people in other parts of the world. And then just to sort of looking forward to where we'll be next week, and that is to say that after 1965, increasingly the Episcopal Church moved away from foreign mission and focused on other issues such as prayer book revision, response to injustice in the United States made clear by assassinations and city riots, the inequality in the leadership of the church, which a group of women in Philadelphia made abundantly clear in 1974 when they were ordained irregularly to the priesthood. And changes in the nation. One of the big changes was the 1965 change in our Immigration and Nationality Act, which increased the number of people coming to this country from overseas and made the founding of mission congregations a new imperative in the life of the church as we had more people coming from the global south. So well, what I will be looking at next week is a response to some of those changes and additional ways of looking at mission since about 1975. And just again, a kind of brief comment, the shift away from foreign mission after 1965 affected the Episcopal Church as a whole, some places more than others. And I've just included some names and clues here that are kind of interesting. These are names some may not know, but they are all associated with Virginia, where we seem to remember mission a little further than, longer than some other folks did. Mark Nickel was a missionary sponsored by the Diocese of Southwest Virginia, who became a mighty figure in the evangelization of the Sudan, and had something to do with the incredible growth in the Anglican Church in the Sudan. Anglican Frontiers Mission was a body created in Richmond, Virginia, supported particularly by St. Matthew's Church in Richmond, that focused on supporting mission in those parts of the world that had no active Christian missionaries. Daniel Deng Bull, who came for a year as a student at Virginia Seminary and ever since has been founding Sudanese congregations for Sudanese refugees. So there is a Dinka Sudanese congregation at Christ Church Alexandria meeting regularly, and Daniel Deng Bull has continued in the Sudan, but he's also worked on supporting congregations in the US. Lawrence Stanley, former member of St. George's Arlington, who went as a missionary to the Sudan, then as a missionary to Haiti, and now as a missionary at the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. So she's made mission part of her life. Joan and Lou Mattia from Fairfax, who went to Virginia Seminary and then became missionaries in Tanzania. Or Uganda Christian University, Steve Knoll, a priest who served in this diocese, went and spent about 15 years with his wife Peggy in Uganda, and help turn a rather small school into a major university that not only offers training for ministry, but other areas. So we haven't forgotten quite as much as some other places, but I will talk about ways in which that ministry is ongoing and continues with electronic means and other approaches next week. And any chat comments or?
Well, I don't see any, but I want to